that's sort of been unrepresented in the archaeological heritage of Michigan. Believe it or not, this photograph was taken just 35 or so miles south of us during World War II. And again, a couple of years ago, I knew nothing about the Tuskegee Airmen's presence here in Michigan. And since then, I've learned a lot. There's a lot to learn still, but I've been very fortunate to work on a couple of these projects around the state in Lake Huron. So I'll get right at it. The United States Army air presence really developed in Michigan during World War I. Selfridge Field was established on the shore of Lake St. Clair at Mount Clemens, just about 30 miles or so out of Detroit. And it was a place to train pilots to operate over big bodies of water, to go to remote places like Oscoda, to shoot it up, to navigate over remote landscapes, and then to come back to Selfridge. Selfridge really was trying to prepare pilots for the geographical kind of conditions that they would expect to encounter when they got to the European theater of operation. Selfridge, of course, was named after Lieutenant Thomas Selfridge. Thomas Selfridge was the first Army Air Corps pilot in the United States Army. Here he was hobnobbing with Alexander Graham Bell. He was a very popular person. He did a lot of flight training around the country. Some of his initial flight training was done with none other than the Wright brothers. In 1908, Thomas Selfridge was getting on this experimental aircraft with Orville Wright. Unfortunately, this was in Virginia. About 6 minutes after this photograph was taken, the plane nosedived into the ground, and Lieutenant Selfridge was the first fatality of an airplane accident in the United States. Whenever you put a bunch of young pilots and experienced pilots together with military aircraft, there are bound to be accidents, and Selfridge Field was no exception. Now, I look at aircraft as potential archaeological resources, and most of the airplanes that I'm going to discuss tonight are in the water or crashed into the water of the Great Lakes. There are about 600 that I know of across the Great Lakes, starting in the 1870s or so, and running all the way up until just a few years ago. Of the 600, they are roughly divided in half between civilian and commercial and military aircraft. Selfridge, being on the shores of Lake St. Clair, had approaches that went over the water, and so very often when accidents happened, the airframes ended up into the lake. A lot of the airplanes that crash on land are no longer in the archaeological record because they've been cleaned up almost to their entirety. There are a few exceptions, like the KC-135, for example, down in Alpena, that's still on large parts of it are still in a swamp at the end of Nicholson Hill Road. But there are a whole variety of aircraft that ended up out of Selfridge during World War I and into the years immediately after. Most of them were biplanes and other kind of wooden airframes. This is probably the oldest airplane that's been discovered in Michigan waters. It's a Thomas Morris 19C. It's in about 200 feet of water just off Oscoda. It was found by a shipwreck hunter while he was looking for a big paddle wheel by the name of Keystone State a few years ago. And you can see the tail here is inverted, laying on the bottom. When it was originally found, it still had the canvas covering, but the weight of the zebra and the quad muscles on that ultimately started to destroy the fuselage covering, and you have now nothing left but the wooden frame. The engine is still intact here, and the wooden propeller is still in place. This went down in 1932. When World War II broke out, Michigan, like all the states around the country, had a lot to contribute to the war effort. We had an industry here, an automotive industry that could be easily converted to build tanks, to build hand grenades, to build airplanes. By the tens of thousands, they pumped them out in places like Willow Run and Detroit. They also had lots of personnel, both men and women, that joined the ranks of the military and do their part for the country. What Michigan did not have were submarines in the Pacific and in the Atlantic that were shooting at Navy vessels while they trained and they operated safely in the Great Lakes. And so one of the ideas in the United States Navy was to train aviators. It was very evident at the attack on Pearl Harbor that air superiority was really going to dictate the war, particularly in Pacific. The United States naval aircraft carriers at the time, many of them were still equipped with wooden biplanes. And the war machine could produce new technology, it could produce new aircraft. The Navy's responsibility was to produce pilots to train them. Now, if you put those pilots in active service and in a theater of operation, where they're under the stress of war, it was ultimately not a good training environment. So the Navy converted these two luxury vessels. They were both about 500-foot long steel paddle wheelers that were the cruise ships of the Great Lakes at the time. And in about 3 to 6 months, they developed them into flat-top aircraft carriers. They operated out of Chicago primarily at Navy Pier. Chicago was a great place to train naval aviators. It already had Glenview and Great Lakes naval bases there, and it had all the infrastructure that was needed to produce pilots there. So the flat tops were developed early in the war, and during the course of about 3.5 years, almost 19,000 naval aviators were qualified to take off and land on aircraft carriers. As soon as they were qualified, they were generally sent to the Pacific. Of the 19,000 or so successful qualifications, about 150 aircraft ended up in Lake Michigan, primarily around lower Lake Michigan off Chicago. And there were a whole variety of naval trainers. Of the 150 accidents or so, only a dozen or so resulted in fatalities to the aircrew, which was a pretty good service record. The flat tops that were used in Lake Michigan were very unlike the aircraft carriers that were contemporary at the time. They had a flight deck that was about 150 to 200 feet shorter than an average Pacific carrier, and because they weren't overnight aircraft carriers, they didn't need the hangar decks, and so they were about 40 feet closer to the water. So when accidents happened, there was a lot less forgiveness in these carriers because they were just closer and shorter, and they're going to end up in the lake. That, coupled with a bunch of inexperienced pilots, this is what's ends up. In the late 1960s, early 1970s, when scuba diving became real popular in the Great Lakes, lots of shipwrecks were discovered, including many of the wrecks here in Thunder Bay. Off Chicago, airplane pieces and parts started being discovered. And there were, again, a whole variety of different aircraft like Wildcats and Hellcats and Corsairs and such. And the preservation of these aircraft being in fresh, cold water before zebra mussels was in an absolute phenomenal condition, where the guns were a lot of times still armed, the air was still in the tires, and instrument panels could still be read. And very many of these airplanes that ended up in Lake Michigan were ultimately recovered under the authority of the United States Navy, and then some were restored to actual flying condition. The United States Navy, the United States government in general, owns all of these airplanes. When there are assets of the federal government, they remain those assets in perpetuity. And so the naval aircraft are no exception to that. And over the years, many of these airplanes have been recovered. Many of them are in places like Midway and O'Hare airports in Chicago. There are 3 airplanes that came out of Lake Michigan that are down in the Kalamazoo Air Zoo. A lot of them end up in Pensacola and other naval air stations around the country. Many of these airplanes, like this Dauntless down in the corner here, were actually in use during the opening years of World War II. The Dauntless actually saw service in Midway. And eventually, as the technology of aircraft and aviation technology increased throughout the war, a lot of these older airplanes that were still in use were flown up to Chicago and became trainers. The Dauntless, when it was recovered in that condition, was restored, but the only difference, a big difference, was that they put it back to the original paint scheme of its service at Midway. So the B-7, for example, is no longer there. That was training, it was its training call sign, and it went back to that color scheme while it was a veteran of Midway. You can see some of the muscles hanging off the wings up here on the Hellcat. And a single Corsair. Now, not to be outdone by Lake Michigan, Lake Huron also had, I was just talking with a gentleman tonight, there were quite a few World War II related military 1880s, after the Civil War, Booker T. Washington developed an institute for young African-American men and women to learn trade skills, to learn engineering, to learn agricultural kinds of skills. Most of these, the original students were freed slaves or from free slave families. So the institute began, and it operated pretty successfully throughout the 19th century. By the 1920s and 1930s, a movement called the Civilian Pilot Training Program started to develop around the United States. The writing was on the wall during the Roosevelt administration. The United States was going to enter the war in Europe. It was just a matter of time. And the United States lacked trained pilots. And so these civilian training pilot programs were developed at a number of institutions around the country. In 1939, Tuskegee in Alabama became a civilian pilot training program for African-American men and women. In 1942, the first class of military pilots were graduated from Tuskegee. The Army Air Corps at the time was very reluctant to not segregate. They wanted nothing to do with having African-American men in service, and particularly in flying service. It was a very tumultuous time in places around the country, including in Detroit, for example. When I first started my research on the Tuskegee Airmen in Michigan, I was told by a librarian down south that the reason that African Americans came to Michigan was because they were free of the segregation that you would experience in the South at the time. And as I started to research that more here, that statement really couldn't be any further from the truth. They were segregated. There was rampant racism in Michigan at the time. Oscoda, in Camp Steele, it was called, at Oscoda, was developed during World War I as a gunnery range for a suffrage field. And originally, Camp Steele was a place just to fly up from Selfridge, to shoot up the place, to turn around and go back to Selfridge. Eventually, Camp Steele at Oscoda was turned into its own air base. It became known as Oscoda Army Air Base, and eventually it would turn into Wordsmith Air Force Base. During World War I, it was the farthest northern base in the United States for Army Air Corps training, and they did a lot of cold weather and a lot of winter training up here. When the Tuskegee Airmen came to Michigan, ultimately, Iosco County wanted really nothing to do with, again, having African Americans in the county, and they actually went as far as passing ordinances to try to not make it happen at all, to forbid their presence in Iosco County. Fortunately, that was just a localized movement. It didn't occur, and they were able to train here pretty effectively for almost 2 years. Now, after a pilot receives their wings in Tuskegee, generally, the first group of them stood around and stayed in Tuskegee for about 2 years. The Army didn't know what to do with these new pilots. They didn't want to integrate them into the Air Force. They didn't know what to do with them. Ultimately, a squadron was formed, the 99th Fighter Squadron, and the entire squadron was eventually shipped to North Africa and eventually to southern Italy, where they basically taught themselves in a combat situation how to do gunnery exercises and how to guide airplanes and bombers up into Germany, into Yugoslavia, to Poland, and other places. The 99th was largely on its own, but they amassed a pretty incredible service record there. Now, eventually, other squadrons, other fighter squadrons, earned their wings and developed at Tuskegee, and then they were sent to other places within the United States and the continental United States for advanced training. And again, one of those primary places for pursuit aircraft pilots were to come to Camp Steele and to Selfridge Army Airfield here in Michigan. The three units, the Fighter Squadron is the 100th, the 301st and the 332nd, or 302nd, would ultimately form the 332nd Fighter Group. And again, eventually would go to Europe, and particularly Italy. When the Tuskegee Airmen started at Oscoda in March of 1943, they were primarily primarily flying P-40 Warhawks, and this was sort of a very common aircraft at the time for pursuit aircraft or fighter airplanes. All of the bomber training happened elsewhere in the United States. They didn't do that here at Osceola. There was a little bit at Selfridge, but for the most part it was just pursuit aircraft and the P-40s. Eventually, after about a year or so in Michigan, the Army switched to the P-39 Air Cobra. The Air Cobra was a unique aircraft for the time. It had an engine that was actually not in front of the pilot up in the nose, but behind the pilot, sitting right back here. So that opened up this whole area for a variety of things. One thing is the airplane was heavily armed. It was a ground attack aircraft. It was very effective in killing tanks and trains and enemy emplacements on the ground. It had, sticking out of the nose, a 37 millimeter cannon, and then there were two 50 caliber machine guns inside the forward fuselage. And then depending on the type of model of the P-39, it would have either one or two additional machine guns in each wing. It also had what's known as a tricycle landing gear. So you have this forward landing gear here that would just fold up inside the forward fuselage here. The vast majority of pursuit aircraft at the time were tail draggers, or they would have their wheel here at the tail. So this increased pilot visibility pretty tremendously. The problem with the P-39, however, was the engine was not very effective as a fighter and a maneuverable aircraft. And so eventually, or very quickly, the Army realized that they had just ordered about 20,000 of these aircraft from Bell in Bell Aircraft Corporation in Buffalo, New York, and they realized they just weren't suiting the needs for the Army at the time. So they tried to get rid of as many as possible. Eventually, they were able to sell many of them to the Russians, who liked them very much, and a lot of these airplanes were flown from Buffalo, New York, across the United States, into the Yukon and Alaska, a lot of times by women pilots, and then they were transferred to the Russians, where they saw service on the Western Front. Just like World War II and any other kind of training exercises, when you put young men in airplanes together, you're bound to have accidents. And again, a lot of the accidents occurred over land, but because they're no longer part of the archaeological record, I haven't focused on them. Now, a variety of airplanes went down, 6 of them, into the water that were flown by Tuskegee Airmen, and I'm going to talk about them individually. All of these, with the exception of the one listed here as Pollard, resulted in fatalities for the pilot and his crew. Probably the most famous of the Tuskegee Airmen at the time was a guy by the name of Sadat Singh. Sadat Singh was a pro football and basketball player at Syracuse. He kind of passed himself off as a Hindu. His father was Hindi, or his stepfather was. He was fair-skinned, and he was able to play and excel tremendously at sports there. When it was revealed that he was in fact African-American, a lot of opposing teams refused to take the field with him. And the Naval Academy, for example, would not play against a team with an African-American on the team. Sadat Singh was, he graduated from Syracuse. He was going to Howard to medical school. When World War II broke out, he wanted to do his part just like millions of other Americans. And ultimately, he would get his wings at Tuskegee. First, he applied to get accepted into that program. There was some delay, so he became a police officer in Washington, D.C., one of the first black police officers for the city there. He eventually graduated in 43C SE class down at Tuskegee, Alabama. 1943, the C means the third month of the year here, so it was January, February, March. SE means single engine or pursuit aircraft versus TE, which would be for twin engine or bomber pilots. So that's Sadat Singh here in the corner, training in a P-40 again. After earning his wings in March of 1943, he came up to Camp to Selfridge Field, and then eventually to Camp Steele, or at Oscoda, and he was flying P-40 Warhawk, similar to this aircraft. He went out over the lake. He took off from Oscoda. He was heading back down to Selfridge. Witnesses saw smoke coming out of his engine, and the plane crashed into the lake. Sadat Singh attempted to parachute out of the cockpit. When he got out of it, the parachute got entangled in the tail fin of the aircraft, and it pulled him down into the lake, and he was killed. About 7,000 people went to his funeral at Arlington National Cemetery, including the mayor, the governor of New York, the mayor of New York City, the governor of New York, where he was from, the governor of several other states, and just lots of people that recognized him for the athlete and the person that he was. Before he joined the Army, he was actually drafted into what would become the National Football League, and he was quite literally the Jackie Robinson of the football world, and it was a tragic loss felt across the country. That's a typo in the Afro-American newspaper. It was just right here off Oscoda. Nathaniel Hill and Luther Blakeney also earned their wings and commissions at Tuskegee Army Airfield in Alabama. They both came up to Selfridge Field and were training out of Oscoda. Blakeney was actually a weather observer. He was a pilot, but at this particular time they were flying a little multi-Valiant. Hill was in command of the ship, and Blakeney doing the weather observations. They were on just a routine training flight. They went out over Oscoda, went out into the lake, entered a cloud bank, and witnesses heard a crash, and that was it. The airplane and one of the bodies have not yet been found. William Hill, another cadet here in the yearbook at Tuskegee, graduated in August 1943 and came up to Oscoda for additional pursuit aircraft training. He was flying out of Harrisville. He was off in a P-39. Q Aircobra was flying out over Harrisville. Something happened with the engine, and the airplane ended up in the lake, and he too was killed. Nathaniel Rehberg was another famous athlete at the time, very similar to Sadat Singh. Rehberg was a professional golfer. He was a collegiate golfer at the time when there were only two collegiate black golfers, the other one being Jackie Robinson. He played for the University of Illinois in Champaign. He wrote golf books and he wrote editorials in newspapers about golf. He graduated here in a joint class with twin-engine bomber pilots and the single-engine pilots in 1943. Flight officer Rehberg was flying a P-39Q Aircobra out of Selfridge Field. He was coming in, doing a big circle over Lake St. Clair, was coming back in for a landing when something happened with the engine. He ended up nosediving. This was in December 1943. The airplane went through the ice in the North Channel of the St. Clair River, and Flight Officer Rehberg was killed. His aircraft was found about 6 years ago. This was the first Tuskegee airplane that I know of that was found in Michigan waters. This is, it's in the North Channel. It's in about 30 feet of water. The North Channel is a very swift-moving current, and a lot of boat traffic, a lot of ship traffic, and it's very often the site is covered and uncovered by sand and sediments. Here you can see that long drive shaft that extended from the engine that was behind the pilot out to the gearbox and the propeller hub. It's about an 8-foot-long drive shaft that literally the pilot was sitting right on top of it, went right between his legs. Most of the rest of the airplane is busted up, and unfortunately this aircraft site has been heavily removed. But there are recognizable features there. It was a pretty high rate of speed impact, and then there were a lot of grappling operations about 2.5 years old, Frank Moody's family moved to Los Angeles to just seek a better living lifestyle. They bought this house in Los Angeles, California on 45th Street. And Frank's dad, Willie, ended up washing train cars for a living. His mom, Savannah, was a servant for a white family there for many years. When she died, when they moved to Los Angeles in 1923, Savannah lived in that house until 2002 when she died. So a good long time. And I'm trying to track down the residents of this home because they purchased it directly from Savannah's nieces that owned it after her death in 2002. Frank Moody went down to Tuskegee and he earned his wings in 1944 in February. This is his last photo of 20 men. I do not know which one of these cadets is Frank Moody. I've never been able to find that out. I'll tell you a little story about that near the end here. But he came up here to Selfridge Field where to receive additional pursuit aircraft training. He was flying a P-39 Aircobra out over the lower end of Lake Huron with 4 airplanes in total. They were about 100 feet off the deck, off the water, about a mile offshore, 6 miles north of Port Huron. Frank Moody discharged all of his weapons, the 37mm cannon in the nose, the guns in the fuselage, the guns in the wings. Something happened to the aircraft. It lurched upward a little bit, then nosedived into the water that was only 100 feet below, cartwheeled several times, and he was killed instantly. About 2 months later, his body, still in parachute and full gear, came ashore down in the St. Clair River. And he's now buried in a family plot in Los Angeles. If it wasn't for this accident, we probably wouldn't have found his airplane. This is a tug and barge that wrecked about 4 years ago in lower Lake Huron. It had a lot of really nasty stuff on this tug and barge. There were oil drums and grease buckets and all kinds of things like that. The wreck stayed in this condition for a couple of months, and then Hurricane Sandy that came up the East Coast actually agitated Lake Huron pretty well. If you remember here, we had some pretty big seas because of that hurricane, and it really messed up this wreck site. So there was a lot of urgency with the State Department of Environmental Quality and with the National Environmental Protection Group to get this cleaned up. And so over the course of about a year and a half, contract divers went out and started picking up this barge and all of its contents. Now, there's a fellow down in Port Huron that runs a dive charter service by the name of Dave Lazinski, and his son Drew Lazinski. They own this dive boat called Diversion. They were a little suspect that this tug and barge were being cleaned up appropriately, so they decided to go visit that wreck site to see if there was anything laying around on the bottom. When they were diving at the spot where the wreck and the tug had been, they found what they thought was an automobile door sitting on the bottom of the lake. And upon further investigation, they came to realize that that door is actually an aircraft door. And if you look at the P-39Q, you got an automobile-style door there. In fact, the Bell Aircraft Corporation contracted with Hudson Motor Corporation to make the doors for these airplanes. So they found the door, and when they were swimming around, they started finding other things that were pretty obvious that came from the airplane. One of the next things they found was the forward main control panel. And fortunately on that was the radio call sign 221226, which positively identifies this aircraft as that flown by Lieutenant Frank H. Moody and lost exactly 70 years earlier to the day when it was discovered. So the Lazinski engine is way over there, and the propellers are way over there. So he wanted to kind of bring all that stuff together to make it more of an attractive dive site. So one of the first things that he did prior to seeking a permit to do that was to actually start mapping it out. And Dave and his son Drew spent a lot of time on the bottom of the lake just looking for pieces and parts of this airplane and then systematically mapping those pieces. And this is exactly what we do as archaeologists. So last year, in August, I wanted to expand upon that map. We were looking into the feasibility of actually recovering this aircraft and maybe conserving and exhibiting pieces and parts of it or in its entirety. But before any action could be taken, we had to map the site out. We had to understand exactly the distribution of the materials, what was there, and what conditions they were all in. So I organized a team of people that I had worked with in the past. Eric Denson, the guy here in the gray t-shirt, is literally a rocket scientist. He's the chief engineer of the Kennedy Space Center in Cape Canaveral, Florida. And he's a good friend of mine. He's dove up here with me a lot of times in the past, right here in Alpena. And when he found out that a Tuskegee airplane had been located in Lower Lake Huron, he was very interested in organizing or helping me to organize this team to go out and document the airplane site. So all of these people are members, or most of them are members of an organization called the National Association of Black Scuba Divers, and they are also members of an organization known as Diving with a Purpose. And they're all professionals in other areas, but what they have in common is they're all very, very experienced divers. And because they're just diving with a purpose, they actually don't just go diving for recreation, really. They want to get involved in things underwater. And a lot of times they're helping to restore artificial reefs or reef populations in the Florida Keys, for example. I worked with Eric and a couple of the other guys on a slave ship down in Key West, Florida, for example. They're very interested in archaeological and maritime heritage preservation projects. And so this Tuskegee project was something that they really, really wanted to come involved with. So we got together in Port Huron last August and were able to spend about a week documenting this airplane site. Stephanie Gandula, standing next to Eric, is an archaeologist here. A lot of you guys know her. She's our media coordinator, and she is a recent graduate from East Carolina University as well, like me and Marlo and John and whoever else is in here. And she's just a fantastic diver and a boat operator, so she was involved. Kamal Siddiqui is an engineer with the Corps of Engineers in Washington, D.C. Melody Garrett is an anesthesiologist in Washington, D.C. Jay Hagler here is an engineer, again, Corps Engineers, and he's also the dive safety officer for the National Association of Black Scuba Divers. And then Ernie Franklin on the end there is a retired school teacher from Washington, D.C., all terrific divers, and gave their free time to help me with this project. A lot of people contributed to the project to make it happen, too. The Coast Guard graciously allowed us to dock our 27-foot whaler right in their facility, and so that avoided the cost of docking and also avoided having to go way out to Black River in Port Huron, and that would have added about 4 more miles each way getting out to the airplane site. So we're right at the mouth of the St. Clair River going into Lake Huron here. The first thing we did was establish the baseline. We put in a set of known data so that we could measure every piece and part of this airplane, adding on the map that was already done by Lusardi. And you can see here, this is the port side wingtip of the P-39. Very faintly, you can see the circle here and a 5-pointed white star on top of the wing there. And then right under my slate is the red running light on the dorsal side of the wing. The wings are intact. They're about 32 feet from tip to tip, and they're more or less intact. The port side is a little bit better condition because it was laying down in the gravel and the sand, and so it was covered and kept kind of out of contact with invasive mussel coverage. The opposite side of this, the starboard side, was up in about a foot up in the water column, and so it was more heavily encrusted and a lot in worse condition. So again, over a course of about 5 days, we were able to map out all of these pieces and parts relative to that baseline. I think it gives you can see this is about 5 or 6 roots. It's about 500 or 600 feet across, east to west, and about the same north to south. So it's a pretty big area on the bottom. And there are a lot of places where it's very fragmented, just little tiny pieces of aluminum here and there.
And why was the distribution so big?
Part of it was the initial impact. You know, it was flying at 400 or so miles an hour. It hits the lake, and it just busted up on that immediate impact. Then it was sitting underwater for 73 years or so. And I wonder if some of it was disturbed during the cleanup operations. A lot of it is missing, and a lot of the fuselage, for example, is missing. And I wonder if it was mistaken for debris that came from that barge and tug wreck that happened right on top of it. So this is my drawing, underwater drawing of the wings. You can see again the port side is considerably more intact than the starboard side. And then there are pieces and parts here, and their distribution on the wing side, that dorsal running light. This piece of armored glass used to sit as a bulletproof piece of glass, about 3 inches thick and around 12 to 16 inches square, and it sat behind the pilot's head. The drive shaft, or a section of the drive shaft here, is sitting here, and again, that would have been in 2 pieces that connected the engine that would sit right on top of the wings to that forward gearbox and the propeller. And then one of the tires here that's retracted up inside of the wings, and it still holds air from 1944. Now, a couple of things that we didn't expect to see are the United States Army's evolution of these aircraft changed pretty rapidly through time. In the beginning years of World War, or the middle years of World War II, they were experimenting with this sort of red outline star insignia with the red bars on the end. In the Pacific, when you see this flash by you at 400 miles an hour or so, it was very easily mistaken for a Japanese insignia. So the United States Army thought it was a bad idea. The United States government thought it was a bad idea pretty quickly. So it was only used between June and September 1943. When you look back at the wings here, you can see the star here, and then this red bar that's sticking out. The other one's missing altogether. It's been abraded off. But it definitely was red, like you would see in June to September 1943. So, of course, this accident happened in April 1944, so why was it still red is a good question. But I can only imagine, based on some other aircraft that were taken out of the lake here, this Navy Hellcat that went into Lake Michigan in 1945, that because these were trainer aircraft, they just didn't care so much about the speed, and they weren't held to the same kind of standards that aircraft that were in a war zone were held to. So going back to Moody's P-39, this is some of the drawings that the Diving with a Purpose crew produced of the tail and the tail fin. They're just beautiful work. And then documentation of the aircraft engine. This is an Allison D-1710. This is it sort of tilted over a little bit onto its port side, a section of the drive shaft here. And then some other pieces and parts that were recognizable. The carburetor shutter upper right, oil coolant over here, and then the gearbox. And only one propeller blade of the 3 is still there. Yes, sir?
Does GPS work underwater?
No, what we do is when we set up a baseline, which was about 400 feet long, we put a buoy, a straight up and down vertical line with a buoy every 50 feet on that baseline, and then we took good differential GPS readings on each of those buoys, so we know exactly where that baseline is underwater now. And then everything on the bottom next to that was trilaterate to that baseline, so you can get good position and ultimately develop that set of plan. So I'm sure there are GPSs that can work to some degree underwater, but we don't have one, so we have to use the buoy thing. And some of the other things. This is the top of a radio transmitter in the upper left, some throttle controls down here. again, these are pieces and parts all over the lake bottom. And then this was a piece of wood that was sitting on the bottom. You can tell that it was cut and sort of tapered, and it looked like, it was definitely a man-made object, but I wasn't sure if it belonged to the airplane or if it was a piece of something that drifted in or if it was by an area shipwreck or whatever. But eventually I found that that was actually